Hello and welcome back to Good News for Your Finances. Today we are in session 7, Good News, a legacy of eternal worth. With me today is Dr. Simon Mould, the Executive Director of the Bridgepoint Forum and the Bridgepoint Foundation, and Scott Hedgecock, who has spent a career in wealth management. Guys, it's great to have you with us on this episode today. Before we get into it, I've got a couple of jokes. So here we go. I've invented a device that prints money. I programmed it to make coins, but for some reason it keeps printing bills. It makes no sense. Sorry. Or one more. Right. I used to make extra money by selling illegal tennis equipment on the side, but I was approached by some thugs who told me to stop. I guess they control the tennis racket around here.
Yeah.
All right, let's get into it.
Oh,
Today, we're talking about good news, a legacy of eternal worth. And a legacy is about more than just the wealth that we leave behind, but really about creating a greater story that future generations can aspire to be a part of. Will your children, your grandchildren, and beyond remember your character, your passion for God and family, your wisdom and generosity? A part of that legacy will be how you set up the family to experience spiritual and financial blessings. So guys, let's talk about this concept of legacy. What does it mean to have a legacy of eternal worth?
I think we have to begin by really determining what is the purpose of what it is that we're passing on, and do we understand that everything we are about ourselves, our sense of identity, even our calling, our mission in life, is something that goes on and is transferred to the next generation, albeit fleshed out very differently. And that finances is a piece to that, but finance is just a tool to accomplish this bigger vision and mission that we have to pass on to our children. And so I think once we begin to see that, our definitions of success are redefined, how we spend our time is redefined, because all of a sudden now, with much greater clarity, I think we have a much clearer sense as to, well, what is it worth in terms of my time, my energy, my resources that I am spending? Where am I actually spending those things, which is really kind of dependent on where I see value in the long term.
Yeah, I just add on to that too, that it reminds me of a quote. I think of a quote from C.S. Lewis where he talks about how, everyone you've met is eternal, right? There's no mere mortals that we encounter in this life. So as you think about you brought up the word eternal, what ultimately is eternal? Well, I mean, there's a few things. I mean, we can start listing them off, but for these purposes, people are eternal, right? And relationships that are formed. And so whether it's the people you interact with on a daily basis, or at work and out in society, or your own family, those are the things that are eternal, is the relationships and the people that you're pouring into. And everyone's leaving a legacy, right? You get to choose to some degree what it's going to be, but you don't get to choose to not leave a legacy, right? The person who has a lot of bad habits and leaves no wealth and leaves nothing behind, they've left their children something, and maybe their legacy is soon forgotten, but then that becomes part of the legacy of why don't the kids know who grandpa and grandma were, or why don't they know who great grandma and grandpa were? Because there was nothing substantive enough from them to be left behind. And so if you think about that, how do you leave an eternal legacy? It's the things that are going to impact eternal people, so everyone you meet, but especially those closest to you, especially those are the people you spend the most time with, and you have the most ability to impact them because of just proximity. So there's that, and then what are the things that you value that that you get to pass on? Because typically the things you value, you spend time on, you're excited about, when it comes to kids, that's what they're going to end up being excited, and that's what they're going to value. So choose that wisely, right? Because there's some things that are going to last, and there are other things that won't.
Yeah. I'd also challenge, I think, our concept of what we think about when we perceive in our mind in terms of what eternity actually looks like. I think as Christians, we tend to think about eternity as being sitting around in heaven just kind of worshiping endlessly, which I think that will certainly be part of it. But Jesus talked about how he always saw his Father working. And if you think in terms of everything that God creates, he creates from eternity. So what are we doing now in the here and now that is going to prepare us for a lifetime of building legacy and building work, and not just a lifetime here on earth, but a lifetime in eternity? Do we conceive that we will actually continue and carry on with the work and the skills that God has given us even into eternity?
Yeah, that's a deep thought, and I love the idea that what our purpose and mission is really what should be driving the way that we think about our finances. And Scott, to your point, what is it that will last from this world to the next? It's really people and therefore relationships.
Yeah.
So how is all of this being driven by relationship? And as men, we're all sons, and in many cases, we're all husbands and fathers. And we see that the Bible has some very specific things to say about what our legacy should look like as it relates to those relationships. So we read that we're supposed to care for our aging parents. 1 Timothy 5:4-8 says, "But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." And then it also says that we should leave behind an inheritance for our children. Proverbs 13:22, "A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children." So this, of course, begs the question, how do I steward my financial resources with this high bar of not only caring for my aging parents, but providing for my children and even potentially my children's children? That's a pretty heavy weight for most of us guys. How would you guys suggest men think about that high bar of stewardship?
Yeah, I guess I would say, so this is what I do for a living, and it's actually really straightforward and simple. There's, we talk about in our field, financial independence, or, how do you steward what you have? And there's really two inputs, right? There's what do you have, right? Or I guess you could argue, what are you making, right? What's being produced? So whether you have surplus or you have reserves of value, right, of money, or if you're ongoing making money, you're adding to it. And then what are you spending it on? What's the output, right? And I think it goes back to this idea of be faithful with a little, and you will be faithful with much. And so if it comes down to those two basic principles, the way that you, one, take care of yourself. So the first thing you have to do is, we always say this, is it's kind of like when you're on the airplane and they say, if the masks come down, because you need oxygen, you got to put your own mask on first. And it's not because you despise your children and you're ignoring them. It's because if you have the mask on, now you're conscious and you're able to help other people. So that's the first step, is you need to secure yourself. You need to not be a burden to others. Okay, so once you have that, now you can start to just do some basic math around, I'm producing more than I'm spending, and now I'm starting to build up surplus. And even if it's just a little bit at first, we live in this awesome society with this incredible ability, not just to invest in ourselves and have our own labors, but we can then go and make investments into other people, right? So whether that's owning parts of other businesses, owning, stocks, owning, if you own bonds, now you're loaning other people money. I mean, there's this way that you get to participate in the productivity of other people. And if you do that, even in a really kind of boring, not flashy way, and if you just do that consistently for years and years and decades, and you let that stack up, that is the magic. That's how it happens, is that you do something faithfully, you do it regularly, and you patiently just let the way that God made the world, which is God made us in relationship, and I have certain skills, and you have certain skills, and you have certain skills, and when we work together and exchange value for that, you do what you're good at, I do what I'm good at, we all just it becomes more valuable over time. And by participating in that process and benefiting from it, and then setting some aside with that long-term view in mind, the system works for you, right? You actually get on the right side of the system, which is now you've got compounding returns on top of compounding returns. And it's not the sort of thing where, hey, I bought the right stock and I hit it big. Like, that's the exception to the rule. That's not the rule. Most people don't do that. Those stories, they get published, but that's really difficult to do. That's luck. But instead, when you're faithful to do the things you know will work, and you're patient, and you work at it, and you're disciplined at it, that to me is that's how you do it. That's the secret, is that there is no secret. There is no magic wand that just makes money. It's the hard work of being faithful with a little and watching it grow, participating in the way that God has made this world, that we get to love and serve each other and do that for exchange of value. And we all become better off through that process. And if you don't participate in that, you should have no expectation that you're going to have anything.
I want to pick up on something you mentioned there that you talked about. Obviously, it's what we have in terms of income and can put aside in terms of investments, but you also touched on what we spend our money on. And I think when it comes to our children, obviously, there's a lot of things that we spend money on our kids, and there are a lot of ways that we convey value to them and we reward them for various different things. My question oftentimes, particularly when it comes to those moments in their life where they graduate from school or they get married or what have you, and one thought is are we buying them toys or are we buying them tools? Because if I can, instead of buying them a toy, maybe purchasing them a car or something upon their graduation, instead, maybe the mindset should be is what tool can I purchase for them, or even go in with them so that they've got skin in the game, that's going to help them develop a particular skill and potentially be something where they can be creative and again, generate their own wealth. So I think tools are more valuable than toys. I think they have that eternal piece to it in a sense, because it's granting them the ability to perfect a skill that maybe will be beneficial to them.
Yeah, that's a great insight, that by giving them that tool, not only do you help equip them for the future, but you're also changing their value system so that as they get older and they begin to make more money, now they're not thinking, oh, I have money so that I can spend it on toys, but I have money so that I can spend it on giving back, producing, creating, being a contributor in this world.
That's right.
And instead of just the consumer mindset, which I think really leads into this next thought, which is that studies have shown that something around 70% of all generational wealth is depleted after the second generation and 90% after the third generation. So essentially what that's saying is that one man or one family does very well, and then the generation that comes after it, for the most part, squanders what that original family has accomplished, and then almost certainly by the third generation, it's nearly gone. So clearly the passing on of financial wisdom in addition to financial wealth is even more important than the wealth itself. So what are some ways that men can leave a legacy of financial wisdom?
Well, I know for me personally, it's been about being honest with your mistakes. Being one that demonstrates good principles of financial stewardship and not just explaining them, but to be open about our mistakes for both my wife and I think for our kids to see, where we have made mistakes and what we've learned from them, because I think there's a tremendous amount, I think, of naivete, as people grow up and they see the world through very rosy glasses, and the cup is half full rather than half empty, which is a wonderful thing. I think that's great, but they have to be able to recognize how we problem solve and how we respond to problems, and how we as a couple, my wife and I, how we demonstrate that with them is so important, and for them to know that we've made mistakes and this is what we learn from our mistakes, and our hope is that by them not making the same mistakes, that they'll be a step further towards achieving a sense of financial independence sooner, so that they can get on with whatever it is that God has called them to do.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Simon's saying. I think there's also just some inherently practical things that are going on societally. Some of those are things we can control. Some of those are things that are more difficult to control, but societally we're not set up to pass on generational wealth. And there's a few reasons why. Some of that is just legal taxation principles. Some of that is our inheritance laws. So generally speaking, there's some math involved, right? So if you have one individual, and let's say that one individual, or a married couple, because that's typically what we're talking about. There's a marital unit at the top. That's generation one that made significant wealth. Well, generation two, even if let's say they had this stereotypical 2.4 children or whatever, so you've got basically two family units. Well, when that wealth passes, now you've got two groups, so maybe four individuals total, now spending off of that, which used to be the wealth that only two people had. Now they had surplus, which is why they're passing it on, but now you've got two. So there's twice as much potential spending, twice as much room for error and making mistakes.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? And also, depending upon how much money that was, it may have gotten cut in half between generation one and two because of inheritance taxes.
Yeah.
Right? And also it's been split equally between the two, whereas in other societies, and I'm not making a value judgment here, I'm just observing, it would go that actually one child would have inherited all of the money, and then it would have been upon them to be the family that is now taking care of the rest of the family, so that the burden was on them to steward it wisely. Well, now you have the burden spread across. And if you have more children, the problem just gets worse, right, in terms of spreading it out. And then the third generation, let's just say you follow the same math. Well, now you've got 8 individuals, 4 family units that are now spending what is potentially, again, half of what even generation 2 got. So now you're dealing with 1/4 of the money or the value that started in generation 1. With all the taxation being paid along the way, now it gets down to 8. So the answer to that is every generation has to be building, right? Every generation has to be adding value, such that you can't rely on the fact that grandma and grandpa had a great idea and started an incredible business that then mom and dad just kind of stewarded. If mom and dad aren't growing that business along with your aunts and uncles to make it bigger, they've already lost a good chunk of it just from inheritance taxes. And the same thing's going to happen again. So the most valuable thing that generation 1 has to think about is it's not enough just to create a business or a stock portfolio or whatever that thing of value is in terms of financial value. I have to also pass along the idea that it's not just on you guys to live off of this and be provided for by what I built. You need to build it to be even better. Otherwise, exactly what you said is going to happen. Even if they do all the right things, even if they're on the up and up and they're great people, just the mere fact that they're spending it down and taxation is going to kick in, that's what's going to happen. The other thing you can do is you can plan wisely. So what a lot of people don't do is you think about the value of if you do have surplus, the value of gifting it now. And let's say, like I just talked to a guy recently who's in his 40s. He's much better off to give parts of his company to his very young children in trust. They don't need to own it outright. Now, because he's going to continue to grow that company for another 30, 40 years. By giving it now, let's say he gives away $500,000 of value now, it's going to grow to potentially be $5 million in the future by the time he passes away. If he waited, that half of that half of that 5 million's going to go to the taxes and government.
Yeah.
Right now it's not, and all of the growth is going to go to where he ultimately wants it to go. So there's just some wisdom in basic tactics, but that also takes trust, that takes family relationships, that takes discipline to say, no, I know that I'm safe to give some of my company away now, and have that value of, I don't need it. I don't have the ego of owning all of this. And you can talk about control and ownership. Those are different things. So there's lots of tactics you can use. But having that long-term vision of saying, I don't want that to happen to my family. And one of the ways I can really save them is by doing lifetime giving to them and setting up that legacy today. So now I'm part of the legacy, and I'm not just thinking about legacy when I'm gone. I'm thinking about legacy today and how do I effectively pass that along.
Yeah.
That makes the math start to work out in your favor.
It does, and I've seen it work. We just experienced this ourselves. Sadly, my father passed away just a couple of years ago, and unbeknownst to my wife and I, he arranged in his will to ensure that obviously my wife and I were going to be, inheriting a portion of the estate, but he also passed on a reasonably significant amount to each of his 5 grandchildren. And yes, it's in trust until they're in a place where they can steward that wisely themselves. But you think about the reality of being in a place where you are able to get into the property ladder in your 20s, after college, and what that does to somebody in terms of their mindset towards stewardship and their ability to leverage that over so much longer of a period of time than waiting for that inheritance to come through me, again, gets taxed again. They don't get to see it for another, probably 20 or 30 years. And so now they're in their 50s by the time they're actually accessing that capital. And therefore the ability to actually leverage that, I think, is much greatly curtailed. So I think you're absolutely right. And it conveys not only the sense of what they're capable of doing for the future, but I think more importantly, it puts on them the sense of ownership and stewardship. And they feel valued. They feel personally valued by their grandparents for having thought that through and not just kind of passed it from generation 1 to 2, from 2 to 3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a real concern sometimes that people have about giving financial assets to children at too young an age. It's like, so that's one way to look at it. I've had people ask me that before. What do we do to control our children? And I say, well, first of all, love your kids. Be a good parent, because if you can teach them good character, good values, that's going to do way more than I could ever help them with in terms of documents or planning. Because if the person ends up having values that aren't aligned with you, that are completely opposite than what you value, there's not a lot that, the documents can only go so far. But the big idea being that there's the positive side of it. If you allow them, like you said, access to those things, and then the creativity and the imagination to say, hey, we built widgets. Our company has always built widgets, and you're going to inherit a widget making machine someday. I want you to be part of that. What would you leverage? What would be the new business line? What would be the thing that, just like I started making widgets because I had the vision, or Grandpa had the vision when he was young and built this, what's your vision? And how can we invest in that? Not just to buy you a Lambo, right? Or not just to buy you a house in Malibu or something, like glitzy like that. But what's the thing that we can actually pour capital and investment into that's going to produce value? And if you have that, if you start generations of people who are value creating people, who ultimately are motivated to do that because they want to love and serve their neighbor.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the eternal thing, right? It's that call to love and serve one's neighbor. Well, one of the primary ways we do that is not through volunteerism, which I love volunteering, that's great, but you also get to do it in the marketplace. And when you do that and you add value to people, God rewards that.
Yeah.
And that will grow. And if you're faithful with that, it'll continue to grow. And so by leveraging that and giving people access and teaching them to be more productive, you're going to have the exact opposite, where every generation is going to get bigger and bigger instead of just whittling it away.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful illustration. And I think, what I hear you guys saying, Simon, is keep the lines of communication open, be willing to share the lessons learned and also the mistakes made, and to really see your children as, your apprentice, that you're teaching them how to be successful, not just how to receive the benefit of your own success, but teaching them how to make their success for their own. And, I think even like Scott, you were talking about, even while you're alive, pouring into your kids or grandkids. My mom and dad, before they passed away, they both invested in our kids when they were going to private school. We were not in a place where we could afford private school for our kids. They said, hey, we think this is important. It's valuable. We're going to invest a part of your inheritance into your children to help them be able to be more successful later in life as well. So I think those are some great illustrations of practical ways that we can communicate this legacy. And I would just say, in addition to what you guys have shared, is number one, if you don't personally feel like you have a lot of wisdom, then be the one to seek wisdom yourself first. Find those advisors, read the books, watch the YouTube videos, go to the Word and find biblical principles that you can begin to put into practice. And then anytime that you learn something, share it. Share it with your spouse, share it with your kids, and let them know that you are on a journey of discovery in your own financial wisdom journey as well. So let's turn the page a little bit on that and go back to Jesus and his words when he said, hey, it's easy to worry about money. It's easy to get anxious about what you have or what you don't have, what you will wear, what you will eat, how you're going to get from point A to point B. And Jesus says this, he says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all of these things will be added unto you. Matthew 6:33. I love what the great missionary C.T. Studd once wrote when he said, only one life will soon be passed. Only what's done for Christ will last. So how do you cultivate an eternal perspective on legacy that involves your time, your talent, and your treasure?
I think you have to ask yourself some pretty deep questions around how do you define success? What do you think success is? And is your means of defining success based on the world's paradigm of accumulating things? Or is success about being in obedience to the will and the ways of God in your life? Because when it's that, then money is just a tool to help accomplish that with my family, with the ones that I love, with the people that I'm called to be around, the people that I'm called to serve, and what have you. So I think we have to be able to answer some pretty big questions first. Rather than look at it tactically, I think we've got to look at it from our heart. Bearing in mind that, Jesus said, where your heart is, that's where your treasure is going to be. So if you value the things of this world, then it's pretty obvious what success looks like, and you're going to be worried about acquiring those things and then keeping hold of those things. When those things are not as important to you, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have them, but the other things are valuable, then it becomes a matter of recognizing that the money aspect of things is just a tool.
Yeah. I just looked up a verse because what you said made me think of it. Luke 16:9, Jesus says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to make friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, they will welcome you into eternal dwellings. So it is a tool, right? And it's actually really easy to make money. Right? I mean, if you think about it. I mean, now, to make really large sums of money, that can be more difficult. But, any of us, if we just wanted to, if not worrying about tomorrow and where your food is going to come from, where your money is going to come from. We live in a society with so much opportunity. If you had no other skills, if you know how to drive a car, you could go start your own small business probably tomorrow, taxiing people around and getting paid for it. Now, that's not a way to make huge riches, but in terms of basic provisions, very few people. Now, there's always exceptions. There's people who are sick and have gone through stuff. But in general, if you're your average normal person, making money is not hard. It's the stuff that you're talking about. It's what do you do with it? How do you use it? How do you see it? And so I think Jesus is spot on, and that seems maybe like Jesus says that. I don't know that a lot of Christians today would say that. Well, I'm going to use my wealth to make friends so that when it's all gone, they'll welcome me into eternal dwellings. And that seems very pragmatic in one sense.
Yeah.
But it's because Jesus, I think, has the perspective, again, we were talking about earlier, is that people are eternal. Values are eternal. Relationships are eternal. The stuff that you have is not. So, why would you seek to keep that when in the end, whether you're Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, or you're Warren Maynard, like we're all ultimately ending up in the same spot, standing before God with none of our wealth matters. All that matters is what did we do to serve our neighbor? What did we do and our family being our closest neighbor, right? So starting with them and then working out to the broader context is that, it's important that we keep perspective and we don't hold on to things too tightly. But again, it's a balance, because hold on to them tightly enough that we can be wise with them and leverage them to do the things that God would have us do, which isn't always what people might assume God would have you to do with it. Like, would people assume that what Jesus was going to say is, use your money to get friends and serve your friends? Like, that's not what most people would say to do with their money. Yet that's what Jesus says to do with your money.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to dwell on, and I think it's interesting how in that Matthew 6:33 verse he says, "Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and then all these things will be added unto you." And I get the sense from Jesus in Him saying that if you seek first all these things, you will not ever get to the kingdom and the righteousness of God. It's kind of like that age-old story of, the professor that drops the rocks into the glass jar, and then the pebbles, and then the sand, and then the water. But if you try to put those things in reverse, there's no room for the big rocks.
Yeah.
And so I think that understanding that Jesus is not saying that all these things don't matter or that they don't have a place in our lives, but that if we get them out of order, then we won't have room for the things that truly matter, which are the eternal things of the kingdom of God. So, guys, this is some really powerful stuff that we're thinking about, some deep thoughts, some challenging concepts. As we wrap this up, are there any takeaways that you would say, this is what I want to make sure my eternal legacy says about me? Because I think that if you guys were to say, this is what I think my eternal legacy should be, that will probably resonate with a lot of other men who are listening to this.
I wrote down a quote from a book that I read by Dennis Peacock, who wrote Doing Business God's Way. He said, riches are something we have. Wealth is something we are. And as I think about that, I think it puts into perspective a lot of what we have been talking about here and being able to discern what is the difference between riches and wealth. And it's not that one is righteous and the other one is evil. Both are necessary. But getting them in the right order. Having riches is important so that we can do what God has called us to do and provide security for our families and all of that. But wealth is something that we are. It's our identity, it's our vision, it's our work ethic, it's our purpose, it's our values. And that is really what I want to make sure that my family has the capability of learning how to apprehend. Because if they can apprehend that and those things, I think they can apprehend riches too.
That's great. Scott, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's Yeah, it's tough because I think it changes. I think it changes over time, and you have to be open to that. Hopefully, we're always learning and developing as Christians. So, I think about what would 64-year-old Scott say as opposed to what would 44-year-old Scott say, and over time it's going to shift. But as I sit here today, for what I would say is what I would hope it would be, is that people understand that it starts from who you are and how do you govern yourself. That's the most basic layer of what it means to be a human, is that you're a person. And I think in terms of that, I would hope that the legacy would be that I was faithful. I was faithful to Christ, because I see, like, today's Good Friday, so we know the great sacrifice that he made to save his people, that he died on the cross for my sins, and that he was raised the third day, which we're going to celebrate on Sunday, Easter Sunday. He was raised for my justification, so that I know that I have right standing with God. And that people would start there, that anyone and everyone who that resonates with, that can say that they would have that they would have that assurance, and that would be a firm foundation of their legacy. But that's about me. So then at some point you have to turn outward, and obviously there's that message for the world, and that's going to resonate with God's people, and they're going to be attracted to that. And then what's my duty outside of that? What's the legacy I leave behind, and what do I want? You said it, you alluded to it, that it's not even about what you tell people, but about what you show them. And so I would hope that I show them a life of, I've said it a few times, of loving and serving my neighbor, because I think that's what God has called me to do. Now that I know who I am, now that I know that I'm saved, my job now is to go out and to love and serve my neighbor. And one of the really refreshing things for me was when I came to the realization that that's not an additional thing I have to do in addition to my life. Like, I got to take care of my kids. I got to be a good husband. I got to go to work. I got to earn a living. I got to try to leave a legacy, and I got to love and serve my neighbor. But really, it flows through all of that. As I'm doing that, that's always the focus, is what are the relationships I'm building? How am I loving and serving others? Which for me, the biggest thing that comes down to is getting to know people, understanding them, seeing where they're at, and how can I serve them where they're at. And that's different for everybody, but that takes the humility to say, it's not that I know what's best for you or for you, but I just get to know you and say, how can I serve you? Right? It's doing that. If that's a legacy I can leave of service, then whereas I sit today, that's about the best I think I could do, especially if I can get other people to do that to others. Because if everybody did that for everybody, think about what the world would end up being.
Yeah.
That's right.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Simon Mould, Scott Hedgecock, for sharing a wealth of wisdom with our guys today. Our memory verse for this week can be found in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. For we are God's masterpiece. He has created us anew in Christ Jesus, so we can do the good things He planned for us long ago. Be sure to come with that memory verse prepared, and also be ready to share your best verse from Deuteronomy chapter 8. I hope that you have some deep and rich conversations with the men in your cohort. If you want to find out more about Impact Players, please be sure to visit us at www.impactplayers.org. We want to inspire you to be a great husband, father, and leader so that you can thrive in the relationships that matter most. Simon, Scott, guys, thank you, and we'll see you next time.